It was a dark and stormy night, the kind where the wind howled like a chorus of wailing spirits and the rain lashed against the windows with unrelenting fury. Nick, a seasoned pizza delivery driver for Tony's Town Pizza, was gearing up for what he anticipated to be a long night of deliveries. The storm had deterred most of his co-workers, leaving him to handle the surge of orders alone. His first order was to an old, seemingly abandoned house at the edge of town. The address was unfamiliar, a rarity given his extensive experience. As he drove, the streets became increasingly deserted, and the only light came from his car's headlights and the occasional flash of lightning. Pulling up to the address, Nick's unease grew. The house looked like it hadn't seen occupants for decades. Vines climbed the walls aggressively, and the front porch was littered with leaves and debris. Despite his instinct screaming to turn back, duty called. He grabbed the pizza box and made his way to the front door, each step echoing ominously through the night. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. The wind seemed to carry his knocks into the abyss of the night. Just as he was about to leave, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping entrance. "Hello," Nick called out, his voice faltering. There was no response, only the sound of the storm outside. Compelled by an inexplicable force, Nick stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him. He fumbled for a light switch but found none. Using his phone's flashlight, he ventured deeper into the house. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Suddenly, his light flickered over a figure standing in the hallway. Frozen with fear, Nick could only stare as the figure slowly moved towards him. It was a woman, or what used to be a woman. Her features were distorted, her eyes hollow, and her movements unnaturally jerky. Nick dropped the pizza and ran, sprinting back to the door only to find it locked. Panicked, he searched for another way out, his breath short and ragged. As he turned a corner, he stumbled upon a staircase leading to the basement. With no other options, he descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of the storm faded into silence. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows and old furniture covered in white sheets. As Nick navigated through the maze, he heard a faint whisper. "Stay," it said. The voice was so close yet so far, echoing around him. He quickened his pace, desperate to find an exit, but the whispered voices multiplied, surrounding him. "Stay with us, forever," the voices moaned. Nick's flashlight then landed on a small, barred window. It was his only chance. He rushed to it, trying to pry it open, but it was sealed shut. As he struggled, the whispers turned into angry shouts. The figures from upstairs were coming down, their steps thunderous in the silent basement. Just as they reached him, Nick managed to break a bar and squeezed himself through the window, tearing his shirt and scratching his skin. He emerged outside, gasping for air, the rain washing over him as if trying to cleanse the night's horrors. He didn't stop to look back as he ran to his car and sped away, the house disappearing into the night behind him. Once he was a safe distance away, he pulled over, his entire body shaking. What had he just escaped from? Was it real or a figment of his imagination? Nick didn't deliver pizzas after that night. He left the town, driven by an unshakable fear that whatever was in that house might follow him. But the story doesn't end here. For, back at the house, in the dim light of the storm, a figure watched from the window, holding the abandoned pizza box, waiting for the next unsuspecting delivery driver to knock on the door. As Nick drove away from the haunting scene, his mind swirled with terror and confusion. The road was slick with rain, the night oppressively dark. Every shadow seemed to leap at him, every gust of wind a sinister whisper. He knew he couldn't return home, not when every fiber of his being screamed that whatever lurked in that house might trace his steps. Determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the nightmare, Nick drove aimlessly into the night. After hours of relentless driving, the fuel gauge alarmingly close to empty, he pulled over at a rundown gas station on the outskirts of a small, unfamiliar town. The neon sign flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows across the deserted lot. Stepping out of the car, the night air felt charged, the silence unnerving. The station was deserted, the windows grimy, and the door to the service shop was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Reluctantly, Nick approached the shop, hoping to find someone, perhaps just to affirm the reality around him, or maybe to share the burden of his terror. The shop was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Tools and oil cans were strewn haphazardly around the room. "Hello," Nick called out, his voice echoing slightly. There was no response, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something moving. His heart raced as he turned, flashlight in hand, only to see a curtain fluttering against an open window. The relief, however, was short-lived. As he turned back, his light fell upon a figure standing at the far end of the shop. It was a man, old and haggard, his eyes deep and dark, reflecting a lifetime of secrets. "Can I help you, son?" The man's voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. Nick, taken aback, stuttered, I just need some gas. And maybe a place to stay." The old man studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "There's a motel down the road. As for gas, I'm afraid you'll have to wait till morning. We're closed." Nick nodded, too weary to argue. As he turned to leave, the old man called out, "Be careful out there, young man. This town has its own ghosts." Chilled by the warning, Nick hurried back to his car, the sense of unease growing stronger. He drove to the motel, an old, two-story building that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. The sign said vacancy in red letters that flickered ominously. Inside, the lobby was covered in dust, the air stale. An old woman sat behind the counter, her hair white as snow, her gaze unsettlingly sharp. "Room for one?" she asked, her voice a crackling whisper. Nick nodded, signing the guest book with a shaky hand. The ledger was old, the pages yellowed, and he noticed the lack of recent entries. The woman handed him a key with a rusted keychain. "Room 8, she said, pointing to the staircase. The room was at the end of a narrow, creaking hallway. As Nick unlocked the door, the wind howled through the eaves, sounding almost like laughter. The room was cold, the wallpaper peeling, the single window overlooking the storm outside. As he settled in, the exhaustion of the night began to weigh on him. Yet, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the building, every flash of lightning seemed to bring images of the haunted house, the woman, and those whispered voices. Hours passed, and Nick lay in the darkness, listening to the storm. Suddenly, a soft knock at the door jolted him upright. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse with fear. No answer. Just another knock, slower, more deliberate. With a deep breath, Nick approached the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob, the sense of dread overwhelming. Slowly, he opened the door to find the hallway empty, the only sound the thunder outside. He stepped out into the hallway, the floorboards cold under his feet. "Hello." His voice echoed down the corridor, met only by silence. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a shadow moved swiftly, disappearing into a room. Nick's heart raced as he followed, stopping outside the door where the shadow had vanished. Inside, the room was pitch black, the air cold as ice. "Who's there?" he demanded, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, his breaths quick and panicked. When the light flickered on, it revealed a room identical to his, yet undisturbed, as if waiting for a guest for many years. Nick's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. The bed was neatly made, dust motes dancing in the beam of his flashlight. An old television sat silent on a dresser, its screen blank and foreboding. As he stepped further into the room, the air grew inexplicably colder, his breath visible in the ghostly light. The silence was oppressive, thick with anticipation. Then, without warning, the television flickered to life. Static filled the screen, crackling loudly in the dead silence. Nick jumped back, his eyes fixed on the screen. Amidst the chaos of static, a figure seemed to be moving, a shadowy form that twisted and writhed. Mesmerized and terrified, Nick couldn't look away. The figure began to take on a more distinct shape, a face, distorted and grimacing. It was as if something from another realm was trying to communicate, to break through into his world. The static grew louder, more insistent. "Leave now." A voice hissed from the television, barely audible over the static. The words chilled Nick to his core. He stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The bulb shattered, plunging the room back into darkness. The only light now was the eerie glow from the TV, illuminating the room with a ghostly blue. Nick turned to leave, his heart racing, but as he spun around, he realized the door was no longer there. In its place was just a wall, wallpapered and unyielding. Panic surged through him, his breaths quick and shallow. He turned back to the television, the figure now gone, replaced by the relentless static. He was trapped, the realization dawning on him like a weight. He searched the room frantically, feeling along the walls, desperate for a door, a window, anything. But the room seemed to have sealed him inside. The air grew colder, the edges of his vision starting to blur. As he slumped against the wall, defeated, the static on the television suddenly stopped. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then, the whispers started, soft and menacing, swirling around him like the wind outside. They spoke of things no living soul was meant to hear, secrets of the dead and damned. Nick covered his ears, but the voices penetrated his mind, echoes of terror that he could not escape. He slid down the wall, his mind teetering on the brink of madness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room changed. The door reappeared, as if it had never been gone. Cautiously, Nick stood, his legs trembling. He raced to the door, flung it open, and burst into the hallway. The motel was silent, the storm outside seeming to have abated. Nick didn't stop to question his escape, he just ran, down the stairs, across the lobby, out into the night. The storm had passed, leaving a strange calm in its wake. Nick's car was where he had left it, untouched. He drove away from the motel, away from the town, the sun beginning to rise on the horizon. The light of day did little to ease his fear, the images from the night forever burned into his memory. As he drove, the road stretched endlessly before him. His mind raced with questions. What had he seen? What had spoken to him in that room? And was he truly safe now, or was he merely being allowed to leave? His journey led him to another town, smaller, seemingly innocuous. He stopped for coffee, the mundane act a stark contrast to the horrors of the night. But as he sat at the diner, the whispers returned, soft and sinister, a reminder that his ordeal was far from over. He left the diner, his body on autopilot, drawn inexorably to a small, old house on the outskirts of town. Their house seemed familiar, somehow similar to the one that had started his nightmare. As he approached the front door, he knew, with a sinking feeling, that his journey into horror was not yet finished. Inside, the house was dark, the air stale with the scent of decay. Nick's flashlight flickered as he stepped cautiously through the rooms. The furniture was draped in sheets, the atmosphere thick with dust and despair. And then, he heard it, the faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the halls. The sound drew him deeper into the house, down a narrow hallway to a door that stood ajar. Pushing it open, he entered a room that was remarkably well preserved. Toys were scattered across the floor, a small bed tucked in the corner. On the wall, pictures of a family smiled down, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. As Nick explored the room, the temperature dropped, his breath clouding in the air. The laughter grew louder, more playful, as if the child was just out of sight, always just around the corner. Nick turned just in time to see a small shadow dart across the doorway. His heart raced as he followed, stepping quietly through the dimly lit corridor. The laughter echoed around him, a chilling sound that seemed both innocent and malevolent. As he reached the end of the hallway, he found himself in front of an old, ornate mirror. The glass was dusty, but as he wiped it clean, his reflection blurred and shifted, revealing not his own image, but that of a young boy, his eyes hollow, his expression one of sorrow and fear. Nick staggered back, his mind reeling from the sight. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to press in on him. He turned from the mirror, only to find that the hallway had changed. The doors that had lined the walls were gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken wallpaper. He was trapped again, the realization dawning on him with icy clarity. His breaths came in short, sharp gasps as he searched for an exit. The wallpaper seemed to close in around him, the pattern swirling and shifting in the dim light. He pressed his hands against the walls, pushing, tearing, desperate to find a way out. But the walls were solid, unyielding. As he slumped against the wall, defeated, the room suddenly chilled further, his breath visible in the frosty air. A soft whisper filled the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Stay with us," it murmured, the voice both a plea and a command. Nick's eyes widened in terror as figures began to materialize around him. Not just the boy from the mirror, but others, men and women, old and young, all with the same hollow eyes and sorrowful expressions. They moved towards him slowly, their hands reaching out, their whispers growing louder. "Stay with us," they echoed, the walls of the room seeming to pulse with their voices. Nick backed away, but the figures surrounded him, their touches cold, their faces inches from his own. He closed his eyes, a scream caught in his throat, his body tensed for the touch he knew would come. But then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The room warmed slightly, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough for him to breathe. Nick opened his eyes, his gaze darting around the now empty room. He was alone, or at least, he appeared to be. With trembling hands, he found his way back to the mirror. This time, his reflection was his own, but his eyes looked haunted, a shadow of fear lingering in their depths. He turned away, unable to bear the sight of himself, and noticed a door that hadn't been there before. It was slightly ajar, light spilling from the crack. He approached cautiously, his mind alert for any sign of the figures, but there was only silence. Pushing the door open, he stepped into a room that looked like a child's bedroom. Toys were strewn about, a small bed in the corner. On the walls were drawings, crayon depictions of a family, smiling and happy. As he moved deeper into the room, the air grew colder again, the atmosphere thickening. The drawings on the wall seemed to change, the figures' smiles turning into grimaces, their eyes scribbled out. A sense of dread filled him, a feeling that something terrible had happened in this room. The temperature dropped further, his breath clouding in the air as he heard the soft laughter again, this time sad and echoing. He turned towards the sound, his flashlight beam landing on a small closet door that creaked open slightly. As he walked towards it, each step felt heavier than the last. The laughter grew louder, a sorrowful, haunting sound that seemed to fill the room. Nick reached the closet, his hand trembling as he pulled the door open. Inside, the space was dark, the air musty. He shone his flashlight into the depths of the closet, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, amidst old clothes and forgotten toys, was a small, handwritten note. The ink was faded, but the message was clear: "Help us, he won't let us leave." Nick's heart pounded in his chest as he read the note over and over. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that weighed on him. He felt a presence behind him, a feeling of being watched. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight illuminating the room behind him, revealing that the drawings on the wall had changed once more. Now, they depicted a dark figure, looming over the family, its features twisted in rage. The air grew oppressive, the darkness seeming to close in on him. Nick felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was not alone in this room, and perhaps he never had been. The house held secrets, dark and terrifying, and he was caught in its grip, unable to escape. As he stood there, his flashlight flickering ominously, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room, vibrating against the walls with a malevolent force. Nick's breath hitched in his throat as he slowly turned around, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his unsteady hand. The air was thick with an unspoken dread, and every shadow seemed to crawl with unseen horrors. The room had transformed yet again, the cheerful wallpaper was now peeling, revealing sinister murals beneath. Images of twisted figures and dark, foreboding woods painted in stark, ghastly colors seemed to watch him with silent malevolence. The toys scattered around the floor appeared older, their colors faded, and their edges worn as if they had been played with by generations of unseen children. Nick's heart pounded in his chest as the growling intensified, a sound so primal and terrifying that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. He could feel the presence of something ancient and evil lurking in the shadows, its eyes upon him, its intentions malevolent. The temperature dropped so drastically that his breath became a visible mist, swirling around him in the ghostly air. The growling morphed into a low, menacing whisper, words indistinct yet filled with an unmistakable threat. "Leave now while you still can." The voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. Frozen with fear, Nick found himself unable to move, his feet rooted to the spot as if the house itself commanded him to stay. His mind screamed for him to flee, to escape the creeping dread that filled every corner of the room, but his body refused to obey. Suddenly, the toys began to move on their own. A small, wind-up train chugged across the floor, its movement erratic. A doll's head turned slowly to face him, its eyes blank yet somehow full of life. The drawings on the wall seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, the figures twisting and contorting into grotesque poses. Nick, overcome with a surge of panic, managed to break the paralysis that held him. He turned and fled from the room, his footsteps echoing down the long, dark hallway. The house moaned and creaked around him, as if displeased by his attempt to escape. The whispering voices followed him, growing louder, a cacophony of threats and pleas. He stumbled down the staircase, each step resonant with the echoes of his own terror. The front door loomed in the distance, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness of the house. As he reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped his shoulder, spinning him around with a force that sent him crashing to the ground. Looking up, Nick's eyes met those of a spectral figure, its visage blurred and shifting, a nightmarish form that defied comprehension. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, a chilling message was delivered in a whisper that seemed to reach deep into his soul. "You cannot leave us, Nick. You are part of the house now." Nick crawled backward, his back hitting the cold, hard wood of the door. He groped behind him, his fingers finally curling around the doorknob. With a desperate twist, he flung the door open, tumbling out into the night. The cool air of the outside world was a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. He scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back as he ran into the night, the house's malevolent energy clawing at his back. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for him as he ran. The small town lay quiet as he entered, its streets deserted, the windows of the houses dark. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, watching him with unseen eyes. Nick's mind raced with fear and confusion, each shadow and sound sending jolts of terror through his already frayed nerves. He didn't know where he was running to, only that he needed to get as far away from that house as possible. But as he passed the town's old, flickering streetlights, he realized something was terribly wrong. The street seemed to stretch infinitely before him, the scenery looping back on itself like a nightmarish maze. With every step, the realization dawned on him, he hadn't escaped the house's grasp. The town, with its silent, watching houses and endless looping streets, was just another layer of the house's twisted reality, a prison designed to keep him forever trapped in its ghostly clutches. Exhausted and desperate, Nick collapsed onto the pavement, the weight of his ordeal crushing him. As he lay there, gasping for breath, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the air filled with the sound of deep, mocking laughter. The house, it seemed, had not finished with him yet. The darkness around him deepened, and from the shadows, figures began to emerge, each one more grotesque and ethereal than the last. They surrounded him, their forms flickering like flames, shadows with substance, whispering in a chorus that melded into a single, haunting voice. "You can run, Nick, but you cannot escape," they intoned, their voices a symphony of despair. "You are woven into the fabric of this place, a thread in its tapestry of sorrow." Nick's eyes darted frantically, seeking an escape, a break in the encircling phantoms, but there was none. The specters closed in, their forms blurring and merging, creating a wall of darkness around him. Just as he felt he might be swallowed by the void, a faint glimmer of light caught his eye. It was small and distant, a mere spark in the oppressive gloom, but it was enough. With the last of his strength, Nick crawled towards the light, the spectral voices rising in anger as he moved. The ground beneath him shook as if the house itself were trying to hold him back, roots and tendrils bursting from the earth to grasp at his limbs. But the light grew brighter, warmer, beckoning him forward. It was not just a light, it was an exit, a way out of the nightmarish reality he had been trapped in. Nick reached out, his fingers grazing the brightness, the warmth flooding over him, promising safety, promising escape. As he pushed through the light, the voices screamed in rage and despair, their hold on him slipping. He tumbled forward, landing hard on the ground, the cool, real ground. When he looked up, he was outside the house once more, the building looming ominously in the pre-dawn light. It was as if the house itself was momentarily stunned, its sinister energies recoiling from his escape. Nick stood, his body aching, his mind reeling from the horrors he had endured. The house stood silent now, as if watching, waiting for its next move. Nick knew he couldn't stay, that the reprieve might be fleeting. He needed to leave, to get far away before the house could weave another trap around him. He stumbled away from the house, his steps uncertain but driven by a desperate need to escape. As he walked, the sun began to rise, casting long, creeping shadows across the ground. The house faded into the morning mist, a spectral entity receding but never truly gone. As Nick reached the outskirts of the town, he dared to look back. The house was barely visible now, a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. He knew he had escaped, for now, but the story was far from over. The house had marked him, claimed a piece of him as its own. As he walked away, the first rays of the sun warming his face, Nick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. He was free, but the house remained, its dark windows watching, waiting for whoever might next stumble into its shadows. And deep in his heart, Nick knew the story was not ended. It was merely paused, waiting for the next chapter to unfold in the haunting echo of the house's call. Nick's steps grew steadier as he put distance between himself and the ominous house, each stride taking him further into the embrace of the waking world. The normalcy of the morning sun, the birds chirping, and the distant sound of a car passing somewhere nearby, all these mundane signs of life contrasted sharply with the night's terrors, yet did little to ease the weight of dread that clung to him. He made his way to a small diner on the outskirts of town, its warm glow a beacon of safety. Inside, he found a seat at a corner booth, away from the few early morning patrons. A waitress, her smile a mixture of hospitality and routine, approached and poured him a cup of coffee. The steam rising from the cup seemed to momentarily blur the boundaries between the real and the surreal horrors he had escaped. As Nick sipped the hot coffee, he replayed the night's events in his mind, each memory etched with chilling clarity. The house, the spectral figures, the desperate escape, they all felt like scenes from a nightmare, yet the fear was all too real. The waitress returned, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "You okay, hun? You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked, half-jokingly. Nick forced a weak smile, his eyes not meeting hers. "Just a long night," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. After the meal, Nick knew he couldn't return to his old life, not when the shadows of that house might still reach out for him. He paid for his breakfast and left a generous tip, a silent thanks for the momentary refuge the diner provided. He drove aimlessly for hours, the roads taking him further away from the town. Eventually, he pulled over at a scenic overlook, a place where the river met the horizon in a serene display. Here, he got out of the car and looked out over the water, the calm surface reflecting the clear blue sky, a stark contrast to the darkness of the house. As he stood there, a realization dawned on him: he could run forever, but he would never truly escape. The house had changed him, marked him in ways he still didn't fully understand. It was a part of him now, a chapter of his life bound in shadow. With a deep, resigning breath, Nick made a decision. He would write down his story, document every detail, every fear. Not just as a warning for others, but as a way to make sense of his own terror. Maybe, just maybe, by sharing his story, he could reclaim some of the power it held over him. Months later, Nick's account was published, a chilling narrative that captivated readers with its depth of horror and palpable fear. He received letters from people all over the world, some expressing sympathy, others sharing their own brushes with the supernatural. It seemed that the house, in its way, had connected him to a community of those touched by the darkness. As for the house itself, it remained standing, silent and imposing, its mysteries and horrors contained within. No one lived there, and few dared to approach it. But it continued to watch, to wait, for the curious, the brave, or the foolhardy. Nick's story ended here, but the story of the house, that story would never truly end. It lingered in the shadows of the world, in the thin places where reality frayed, always waiting, always watching, a reminder that some doors, once opened, and never fully closed. And so, as the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the land, the house stood silent against the dying light, its windows like dark eyes, watching the world go by, patient and eternal in its haunting.